Good morning to you on the West Coast in the Pacific time zone. Good afternoon to others of us. I'm very grateful that Eli Enns is here. There's a bit of a fancy introduction in the description to this video, but for me, he's one of the smartest people I've ever interviewed and talked to. So I encourage people to join in and ask difficult questions. Let's try and give him a run this morning, get his mind going. But Eli, do you mind just introducing yourself to start off?
Yeah, sure. So, and thank you for that very kind introduction. My name's Eli Enns. I'm from Tla'ukwit on the west coast of Vancouver Island, on my father's side of my family. And my mom was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, in St. Boniface. And she grew up on a farm in Manitoba and, went out west in the 70s kind of a deal. So I come from those two cultures, a Dutch Mennonite on my mom's side, gone hippie kind of a deal. And yeah, just want to acknowledge everyone who's grieving today. Chantal Moore is part of our family on the West Coast, and the family, managed to have a funeral this morning, and I just want to acknowledge all of them, and as people start traveling home.
Thanks, Eli. Thanks for that. Can you tell a little bit about your work? How did you get involved in the work that currently claims a big part of your life and what you do? How did you get involved in that kind of work? Indigenous conservation, tribal parks, and really breathing life into your own laws and trying to see that implemented in Canada's governing system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's been said for many years now that being born Indigenous in Canada is being born into politics. And in my case, that was the coming together of two cultures. My father's Nuu'chah'nulth heritage and my mother's, as I mentioned briefly, my mother she didn't want to work, she didn't want to live on the industrial farm in Manitoba. And they ended up, there's the civil rights movement, women's liberal rights movement, the flower child kind of revolution, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and all of that, and the Cultural Revolution carried many of those folks out to the West Coast, and were represented at the blockades in 1984. Many of the newcomer folks who didn't agree with the kind of industrial forestry that was happening to the ancient cedar rainforests of the West Coast. And so those two cultures came together in what I consider to be true reconciliation. Before the term was trendy or even noted, Indigenous peoples and newcomers were coming together around their shared values of social justice and environmental stewardship. And they worked together in 1984 to create the Mears Island Tribal Park. And it's important to note that in Nuu'chah'nulth, we would never have had tribal parks 500 years ago. The whole notion of saying that one part of your territory is special and it should be protected, and then what does that infer? That another part of your lands is not worthy, or should be sacrificed for human use. From a Nuu'chah'nulth perspective, Hishuk Ishtzawak, it means everything is one and everything is interconnected. So the very notion of parks and protected areas is a symptom of a dysfunctional way of seeing the world in disconnected pieces. And so how I got involved was simply the nature of my own reality, that I'm a mixed blood person, and then my mother instilled in me a value of environmental stewardship and social justice throughout my growing up years. And yeah, I experienced racial profiling by police in Manitoba when I was 12 years old. So that's kind of on point of what's going on across North America right now, and the Black Lives Matter movement and Indigenous Lives Matter. I had my experience with that in my adolescence, and then became passionate about studying and understanding the Canadian justice system. And it didn't take me long to see the connection between the removal of Indigenous peoples from their homelands and funneling into urban areas and conflict with the Canadian justice system, and then incarceration and what you call recidivism, which is, the revolving door of the jails. And so it truly is an interconnected, wicked problem of disruption of relationship to land, whether it's for an industrial activity, extraction, or whether it's actually the creation of a park. Like many parks disturbed and removed our people's relationship to the land. And so I studied Canadian political science with a focus on the Canadian justice system. I was interested in reforming the courts. I was interested in reforming the way that corrections worked, or jails, and policing. And what I eventually arrived at, Emily, is that I don't know if it's actually still a thing, but it was at the time when I was going to university. It's called the National Crime Prevention Center, and they talk about crime prevention through social development. And I think that reforming the policing, reforming courts, and reforming corrections all needs to happen. And it is going to be a major undertaking. There's going to be a lot of people that are going to have to cooperate and work together on that. But in the meantime...
Can I interrupt you quickly, Eli? Can we come back to this? I want to come back to this and let you continue, but just to clarify for people, because I talk a lot about and report a lot on Indigenous laws and Indigenous governing systems, right? And how that's so related to what we know as stewardship practice or conservation. These are more colonial concepts of like managing the land, right? So we're trying to find this middle language, and you and I, being these mixed-blooded in the middle people, are trying to do some of that work in that space. But can you explain for people, how is Canada's governing system formed? How old is it? We have a constitutional monarchy to this day, is that right? Like, can you explain how Canada's governing and court system works, and then we can jump back again.
Yeah. So it starts at the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Just kidding. So the word Canada is a word in the Haudenosaunee language, Kanata, meaning village. And King George III benefited greatly from his treaty relationships with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and their military alliedship in the 7 Years' War against the French. And then again, and so after the 7 Years' War with the French, King George issued his Royal Proclamation of 1763, which he essentially said that it was an extension of chivalry, and to confirm that no business dealings or no land transactions will happen until there's a proper treaty in place according to the customs of the people. And that Royal Proclamation was received at the Treaty at Fort Niagara in 1764, which is a really critical note because the proclamation itself was only one half of a dialogue. What was reflected back in the wampum in the Treaty of Fort Niagara, 1764, was parallel sovereignty and coexistence, peaceful coexistence. Peace and friendship isn't just a cool hashtag. The people, there's a deep philosophy to that. And one way of understanding that in modern terms is looking at the notion of positive peace versus negative peace. So positive peace is not just the absence of war or the absence of conflict. It also is the presence of good relations and justice. So let us have peace and let us have a friendship. Zagindawin, as Dr. John Burroughs explains, is one concept of love in Indigenous language. Let us have an abundant relationship. And so the peace and friendship treaties were about parallel sovereignty, peaceful coexistence, and mutual benefit. And certainly during some of those early days of relationship, there was mutual benefit, but it took a turn for the worst. King George again needed his treaty allies in the War of 1812, and there was the Pledge of Allegiance by the Crown, I believe it was 1815, with a very powerful symbology of a wampum belt with a zagging design on it. And they said the zagging design will represent our relationship that, sorry, my phone's buzzing away over here. The Pledge of Allegiance says that we're going to have ups and downs in our relationship in the future, but it'll be our love and affinity that will carry us through those hard times. And so that was one of the big teachings that many of our societies across Canada have passed on, is the importance of love in getting us through these tough times. And so Canada was born out of treaty. It was born the best way to understand Canada is it's a multinational state that's formed on Euro-Indigenous international agreements. And flowing from those international agreements comes the certainty, if respected. And by the way, the peace and friendship treaties have built into them that we will live respectfully on the land. As long as the grass grows, the river flows, and the sun shines. They have also been referred to as multilateral environmental agreements, because even in 1764, the elders were concerned with the behavior of the newcomers. Their consumption patterns was concerning to the elders already, and so they predicted that if the newcomers continued to consume the way that they were going, that they would bring about bad times for everyone. And so those predictions have come true. And now what the elders have told us in many cases is that it is our love that will now be most important when the newcomers come to us and ask for help. Anyways, you asked me a very pointed question and I went down a rabbit hole again. But so that's what Canada is. And that's why a lot of our people win in court, because when Canada violates Indigenous lands and laws, they're actually violating their own constitution. And I want to hover over that for a second, because we need to understand that it is wholly possible, and it's done on a regular basis, for provincial or federal governments to create legislation that is actually illegal in this country, that violates their own constitution. And I use the Charter of Rights and Freedoms as an example. The Conservative government under Stephen Harper's leadership created legislation about doctor-assisted suicide, they were calling it. And the Supreme Court of Canada found that legislation violated the charter rights of Canadians. So it was slapped down, and the court said, go back to the drawing board. And same thing with the abortion law that they created. They created abortion law that violated the charter rights of women in this country. and that was slapped down. So similarly, and people call it the Charter Challenge. So since 1982, with the introduction of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, every existing piece of law, legislation, and every new law that's created is subject to the Charter Challenge. And we need to have a similar thing with Section 35 of the Canada Act of 1982, which, by the way, did not create anything new. It simply recognized and affirmed existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. And so in order to uphold the honor of the Crown, and in order to improve the world for the unborn generations to come, we need to usher in a renaissance of peace and friendship and this notion of positive peace, which has other economic and geopolitical implications that I'll get into in a minute. But I sense that maybe you want to ask me a directing question.
I just want to digest everything that you're saying, but I can do that later. We can do that later. I think it's really amazing to hear how, and I don't think it's by accident when you say something like, if we want to honor the Crown, right? You're using colonial language because you're speaking in many ways to Canadians and what some folks understand in their own legal sphere and realm. And then you follow it up again with your own Indigenous worldview. And if we want to protect the well-being of the planet for future generations. And so you do that quite seamlessly, you know, using different languages and different perspectives and tactics to talk about the same thing. And I do think we need a lot of that right now. I think we need to understand in many ways how we're connected and how we need to work together. And you work in that space in a big way. So please feel free to just continue, you know, feel free to talk about some of the work that you're involved in and what that could look like.
Okay, well, you know, maybe just to round that up, I laughed earlier about the Treaty of Westphalia, but it's actually an important point. The Treaty of Westphalia established what even today international political scientists often refer to the national state system as the Westphalian state system. And the reason being, and this was the resolution of the 30 Years' War, and what the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 established was the notion of sovereignty and within kingdom walls. And now the kingdom walls are state boundaries. And interestingly, 5 years later, in 1653, Thomas Hobbes published his book, The Leviathan. And it's the basic, it's a simple form of social contract that I don't, we asked earlier what Canada is. Well, Canada, everyone who's born into this country, and if you get registered with a birth certificate, you become a party to a social contract that most people don't understand. In fact, immigrants often know more about Canadian law because they have to pass a citizenship test. But we don't have such a thing. When you turn 18 years old, people go to the bar and get drunk legally for the first time. That's the coming of age ceremony in many places in Canada. But we are all bound to this social contract. And in 1653, the Leviathan established the basic premise of social contract, which is that if we agree to create a society, then the most basic form of social contract is to say that we acknowledge that we all have total rights. And I don't 1,000,000% agree with the premise, but this is what it was, is that I have the right to do harm to you, and you have the right to do harm to me. That's part of our total rights. But if we create a society and we agree to live together, then we forfeit our right to do harm to each other. And that collective forfeiture of rights becomes the metaphorical Leviathan, which is the sovereign, holds the sovereign authority. So if somebody violates the social contract and does harm to another member of that contract, it is not the victim that has to seek retributions against the perpetrator. It is the Leviathan that will dole out justice on behalf. It's not seen to be just a violation of that one individual. It's a violation of the social contract. Therefore, it is a violation against everyone. And so today, when if somebody commits murder in Canada, it's not just a crime against that individual or their family. It's a violation against the crown. And so you have this idea of crown prosecutors that they carry out retributions on behalf of the whole of society. Anyways, I mean, that's you know, the really basic social contract that we're all party to, and
Right.
and so
No, and I think it's important to really clarify and lay out, because there are a lot of people, you know, there are a lot of Canadians, for example, that think that, well, this is just the way things are. These are the laws, these are the way that things are, right? It's just taken as normal.
yeah,
You know, they don't think about other worldviews, other legal systems, because the education system, because the history of newspapers, you know, there's a lot of reasons why. But in talking about social contract, it reminds me of, I don't know if you know Trevor Noah, he was talking about social contracts in societies as well, and how people are burning buildings, right? And defacing vehicles, and, you know, toppling slave trader statues into the water, and beheading Christopher Columbus statues, and all of these things happening because it's a manifestation of people expressing the violation of these contracts, right? And people saying, why would people not take to the streets and not vandalize corporate capitalist spaces if the people who are the Leviathan, the people who are supposed to be upholding their end of the contract, are not doing that, right?
yeah.
In fact, they're doing the opposite. So there's a ton of violations of these contracts happening. So where does that leave us today, Eli?
It leaves us on shaky grounds, and I just want to respond to some of the comments that I'm seeing there about. In Tlaloquid, where I'm from, we don't have any of those historical treaties either, and we don't have a modern day treaty. We voted no against the agreement in principle, and you know, it's a hot topic. But I'll say this, that one of my areas of focus when I was studying Canadian political science was the BC treaty process. And all you have to do is look back at the questions in the referendum of the Liberal provincial government when forming their mandate for negotiators. It's really not, it's very upsetting. Go ahead and Google that. Anyone who's interested. It wasn't done in good faith. In fact, the referendum itself, I consider to be a violation of constitutional law. And so you have this comprehensive land claims process and administrative agreements that is not, I don't believe that's truly a peace and friendship agreement. And yeah, that's right. We don't have many treaties in British Columbia, but I also want to acknowledge that all of the nations I've ever talked to across Canada who have peace and friendship treaties, they do not feel that they have ceded their land. They have agreed to live in peace and friendship, not to give away all their land. And so when we say that we live on unceded territory on the west coast of Vancouver Island, where I'm from, that's true. But it also suggests that other nations have ceded their territory, which is not true. And by the way, even in those lands where they have historical treaties, those historical treaties are very much alive today in law. They just have been disrespected. My heart goes out to my Wolastoqey brothers and sisters out in New Brunswick, and God bless them. They're taking care of our people so well over there. And on the walls of the room in the Maliseet Conservation Council in Fredericton, a room that I know very well, I've been there many times over the past 3 years, they have a beautiful poster on the wall. And on there's there's a story of treaty making. In the first era it's a circle divided into 4 quadrants. And in the first one, and it represents time. And the first quadrant is the era of Indigenous diplomacy. The second quadrant is the era of treaty making. And the third is treaty denial. And the fourth is treaty litigation. And what I would suggest, and I know this is a prickly conversation, but what I would suggest is that we have many Indigenous diplomats today that are trying to resuscitate the good, to make Canada great again. No, I'm just kidding. In the peace and friendship case, I couldn't resist. Because they're so simple but so elegant. I tell you, I've listened to so many elders talk to me about their understanding of treaty, and it's beautiful. And it's about sharing, generosity. We know about that where I'm from on the West Coast, and our potlatching tradition, giving things away to other people. And anyways, I can't help but see all these comments here.
Are they distracting? I don't need to post them, but
no, I think it's lovely, and I want to hear it all. So go ahead. What's the next question here?
Yeah, let's check this out. It says, and then I do want to go back. I want to go back. You mentioned your potlatching society, and you also talked about challenging this concept, the way we think about economy in Canada, right? So I do want to go back and talking about alternative ways of conceptualizing on economy and what alternative economies could look like, old ways forward. But let's just check out this question. The Canadian government has violated their contracts since the beginning. As First Nations, we had and still have our own laws. We live by those laws, even through colonization, and Canadian laws we treat secondary, in my view. So that's Joyce Charlie Boy. I don't know exactly where Joyce is from, but Charlie Boy is a real Tethcoatine name. So maybe Tethcoatine, maybe they'll let us know. But that's a good segue into talking about ongoing Indigenous laws.
Okay, cool. So there was a meeting that was held in Opitsat on Mears Island, which is the village where my father grew up, off the west coast of Vancouver Island. And that was in 1914. There was representatives of the federal crown government who came to see how Confederation was working out for our people. Because British Columbia entered into Confederation in 1871. Of course, we didn't consent or have a hand in that. And what our leadership under Eddie Joseph, late Eddie Joseph Wickaninish, said that it has been 5 years since our people have been charged and fined and jailed for living in our land. And he recalled that Harry Gilead, who was the first Indian agent to come to our territory in the 1880s, when Harry Gilead came with the bishop, and church and government was working together, of course, at that time. And in the survey crews, they surveyed out the Indian reserves. And our people asked them, they said, "Hey, what are you doing there, Mr. Gilead?" And Gilead said to them, he said, "Don't worry, this is just a formality. No one is ever going to want to come and live in your land. It's too wild, and you cannot farm there." Because at the time, you could walk from dawn till dusk and get, as an immigrant settler, you could get a whole bunch of land in North America, in the plains or whatever, to farm, which was much better land for agriculture than our land. Because in our land, once you cut the trees down, the soil base is so narrow and shallow, and the rain comes and it gets washed away, and you can't grow crops in there. We're not supposed to be farming that place anyways. And so Harry Gilead gave his word that no white man would ever want to come and live in our territory. So that was the 1880s. And then in 1909, so it was 5 years prior to that meeting in Opitsat, in 1909, they started doing exactly what they said they were not going to do, which is enforcing the reserve boundaries. So up until 1909, it was Nuu'chah'nulth law. Nuu'chah'nulth law ruled the land and the waters. And between 1909 and 1984, that's only 75 years. So for 75 years, our own sovereignty was interfered with, and our relationship to our land was interfered with. So the Mears Island Tribal Park was an act to regain control. And although it was done in cooperation with the hippies, it was IISAAK. It was the Nuu'chah'nulth law of respect represented by the sun moon crest. That is what prevailed. And because, Michael Mullen sought an injunction on behalf of the newcomer people that were our allies. And we sought an injunction, and then the logging company sought an injunction. So you had 3 requests to the courts, and only 2 of them were upheld. It was our Nuu'chah'nulth request for injunction and the logging company, and then the province took over on behalf of the logging company, and we took them to court and we won in 1985. We won the Mears Island court case. We presented tons of evidence, archaeological, ethnographical, historical, testimony from elders, and to say that it is not a tree farm, that it is Nuu'chah'nulth. The name of that island is Nuu'chah'nulth. It is not a tree farm. And then when the courts asked the province at the time to provide evidence that it is BC Tree Farm License 57 or whatever it was, the province had no evidence to support that claim. So 1984 was a turning point in our territory, and it's been 36 years. So imagine it took 75 years to do the damage that they did. Now we're 36 years, so we have 40 more years. And I think in 40 years, we're going to do some amazing stuff with our tribal parks and working collectively with local people. I have to say that in my own time, working for 7 years, I worked directly for my own nation and forwarding tribal parks and whatnot. That was Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper was in Ottawa, and most of that was with Christy Clark in Victoria. But we got a lot done because we were working at the watershed level with other people who shared our vision of having a better society and a healthier environment. And I have to say, if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, the thing that I want people to know is that is the place where true reconciliation can happen, is at the watershed level between people who have to live together and who have to live with the consequences of their decisions. It doesn't happen at conferences. It doesn't happen in the halls of power. It happens at the watershed level among human beings.
It's interesting you say that. I made a note of that actually, because I've heard you say that before, people having to live with the consequences of their decisions. And in many ways, many Indigenous peoples across the world have to live with the consequences of their decisions, depending on where you are and how you're situated. But right now, I would argue that everybody is having to live with the consequences of their decisions because of coronavirus in some way or another, right? Yeah. Even people who are very removed from the consequences of their decisions, maybe in urban spaces, city spaces where you consume, you support perhaps corporations and companies that you don't have too much relationship with. And a lot of us have these kinds of, realities woven into the fabric of our lives. And then you put out the garbage and you don't see it again. And everything, like you said, is very disconnected and very out of sight, out of mind. Conveniently, strategically, we know this. So how do you feel about this moment? I've wanted to ask you this. How do you feel about this COVID-19 world health pandemic? Is this us having to live with the consequences of our actions? And are we learning something in your mind?
Yeah. So when I was a boy, I heard a story from an elder from Manitoba. I believe she was from Sioux Valley Dakota Nation. I don't remember I was 9 years old anyways. And she told us the story about how many, many years ago, there was a hunter who was not a hunter. He made himself out to be a great hunter, and he would always come back with more deer than the other hunters. And there was something unsettling about this hunter. And so long story short, they ended up discovering that he had enslaved an entire herd of deer, and he was keeping them closed up in a cave, and he was feeding them like hay and keeping them alive in there. And then he would just go and kill a couple whenever he wanted to go. And the deer gods, the deer spirits came together and made counsel and said, what are we going to do with this guy? He's violating the liberty and dignity of these creatures, of our children, our babies. And so they created a disease, and they infected one of their babies with this disease. And that baby ended up going into the family of this hunter who was not a hunter, and it infected his family. And so that was showing how when we do not respect life, that Mother Nature and life, it'll bring balance back. And I'm reminded, it was interesting that we had Charlie Boy on there because Marilyn Baptiste, who I consider her like my older sister, she's from the Chilcotin, from Hanigwitine. She told me something.
So badass.
Yeah, she's wonderful. She told me something really cool about climate change. She was passing on some insights that was shared with her from her elders in Hanigwitine when they were talking about fighting climate change. And they said, why do you want to fight our mother? Our mother is cleansing herself, and she's smudging herself, and she's healing. We don't have to fight her. We have to learn to respect her again, and help her heal. And so the disease is viewed in the same way, in my view. It was fascinating because, like, I grew up back and forth between Manitoba and Tofino throughout my life. But in Manitoba, when I was a young man, they used to have slaughtering facilities. Well, they still do now today, but they used to have slaughtering facilities that employed people from Manitoba. And they demanded, they're unionized. Look up the Regina Manifesto. It's one of the roots of the socialism, Canadian socialism, the Regina Manifesto, and social democracy, healthcare, universal healthcare, whatnot. But it also, so strong unions, and the corporations wanted to relax labor laws to allow to bring in immigrant labor force and pay them less money, right? They wanted to bring in workers from Mexico and other places like that. And the unions wouldn't allow it. And the unions were very powerful voting. So what the corporation did is they shut down those facilities, and they moved their facilities south of the border into the United States, where there was more relaxed labor laws, and they could get access to cheap labor from developing countries, so-called. And then when the mad cow disease hit, this is spina bifida. When the mad cow disease hit, they could no longer move live cattle across the border. They had to be killed and slaughtered and tested for spina bifida before the products could enter the United States. So they had to, overnight, they had to reestablish their slaughtering and processing facilities north of the border. And because it was a disease outbreak and it was a major threat to the economy, the provincial government gave the corporations what they wanted, and they relaxed labor laws, and And I saw it myself. I saw an influx of new people from different countries that were coming in and working for much less than what the unions had demanded. And it is hard work. It's unpleasant work. I mean, all day long, killing animals in the horrific conditions that these creatures live in. It's psychologically damaging, I think, for anyone to be in that environment. And so my point here is to say that we now have chronic wasting disease. No one's really talking about that, but they should. And that comes.
Yeah, I wrote an article about that. I'm going to link it.
Awesome. And that is exactly like that little grandma told me when I was 9 years old, because we fail to respect the liberty and dignity of other creatures, and then the diseases come. And interestingly, the way that chronic wasting disease was described to me, these ranchers, it's just goofy all the way through. These ranchers, they trap these ungulates, wild ungulates, and then rear them in captivity, and they're stressed out in there. And science says, that under those stressed conditions, that's where disease can come about. And of course that happens. We know that about us too. We as human beings, we live a stressful life all the time. We're more likely to get sick and have disease in our own captivity. But anyways, that's a bit of a rabbit hole, but just simply to say that, yeah, the pandemic does offer us an opportunity. And by the way, when I started doing work in tribal parks, which is now, broadly Indigenous protected and conserved areas, the elders told me the story about the smallpox. Oh yeah, you also did an article on this as well. You've got it all covered, Emily. But I'll just say that, our elders told us, they said, if there's we need to prepare, there may be another smallpox type epidemic, and we need to have places of safe refuge, places where people can go and have the basic necessities of life and in any time in the future. And really, and then yes, the pandemic is the ultimate leveler of the playing field in some ways. But it also, what I'm really enjoying is people talking about essential economics and realizing what is truly necessary and what is just frivolous. Interestingly, a lot of that frivolous economics is part of how we got so far of the true meaning of the word economy, which I can touch on if you want.
Please. I was just going to say, okay, let's go there. What is essential economics and what are frivolous economics?
Yeah. So the word economy itself is one of those words that gets used a lot, but not many people really understand what it means.
That's right.
And so somebody asked me the question in the last big recession, 2008. Dr. Peter Trainer, we were playing chess, drinking wine, whatnot, and he asked me, because at the time everyone was talking about the health of the economy. The economy is up or the economy is down. They were talking about the economy as though it's a thing. And he just made a remark. He's like, that's very different from when I was growing up. And he's an older fellow. Well, he's not that old, but he's my senior, and he grew up in England, and he's an engineer, and and when he was studying, he said, we use the economy much differently. And so I developed a thought exercise that I do from time to time. It's called the 3 eco thought exercise. You got the word economy, you got the word ecology, and then ecosystem. Yeah, ecosystem, ecology, and economy. So ology is the study of ology, like biology is the study of bio, geology is the study of geo, which is earth, bio is life, biology is the study of life, ecology is the study of eco. Eco comes from the Greek language from a word oikos, O-I-K-O-S, oikos, and it's the idea of the home. And so there's different types of ecosystems. There's rainforest ecosystems, desert ecosystems, all over the world, different kinds of ecosystems. And so what then is economy? And this idea of house, by the way, it's not just the physical house you live in. It's a bigger metaphorical idea of the home that we all share. And so economy, then, when you look at the true meaning of the word, it's not a thing, it's a relationship. It's economy is the wise and prudent management of the house, of oikos. And so
it's not GDP.
No, and it's not supply and demand or the invisible hand or any of those things. Those, and you know what? It's interesting. We talked earlier about the Leviathan. What's fascinating to me is that in modern terminology, the way that the word economy is used, it seems to me that we have replaced we've created a new sovereign, and the new sovereign is the economy. If something is not good for the economy, it's bad for the economy, and we should not do it. We went from asking what the role of government used to be, I mean, at least superficially, and the role of government in Canada used to be about how do we create a more fair and just society, and somewhere along the way, it became how do we create more jobs, and so it's fascinating to me to see how the change of the use of the word economy has changed over time. And you know what? From an Indigenous, when you look at Indigenous economic theory and practice, our people had ingenious ways of managing that relationship. We had ingenious ways of developing resilient economies. And I would encourage everyone to look at the work of a fellow named Dr. Ronald Trosper. In 2009, he published a little blue book called Resilience, Reciprocity, and Ecological Economics. And the subtitle was Northwest Coast Sustainability. And Trosper, who is a Harvard economics guy, he's went to Harvard, studied economics in Harvard. He was interested in the Global Resilience Alliance, which is a bunch of academics and former bureaucrats and diplomats who produce something called social ecological resilience theory. And they look at the intersection of social and ecological systems, and they produce theory about threshold transformations, that when a system experiences a certain amount of external impacts, that it'll eventually transform into a new type of social ecological system. Anyways, what Trosper saw was that there was a blind spot in their work, that they had not involved Indigenous economic theory into the equation. And so he did this research on the pre-contact societies of the Pacific Northwest. And he did an inverse, in a way, of that series called Collapse. Collapse looks at ancient civilizations that destroyed themselves and failed, and it looks at what are the common denominators, what were the mistakes that those ancient societies made that led to their demise. And so resilience, reciprocity, and ecological economics is an inverse of that, in a way, because he looked at these societies of the Pacific Northwest that had a proven track record of resiliency for 10,000 years plus. 2,000 years, the mark of a great civilization, apparently. Somebody thought that up. And we have our societies that lasted for 10,000, 13,000, and then longer. But this is just the proven archaeological record. proven archaeological record says that that our societies lasted for 10,000, 13,000 years. And so anyways, Trosper goes into great detail about what were the common denominators of success for these pre-contact societies. And one of them was generosity, and how, like the whale hunt is a great example. Our people, Nuu'chah'nulth, were whale hunting society. And when you go out and you get a whale, it's a major undertaking. But when you bring that whale home, that's like bringing home $1 million paycheck to your family, right? Mm-hmm. Huge influx of resources into the community. But what we do with the whale, we don't put it behind a locked door and key. That whale is ceremoniously shared with everyone to come in a festival of relationship and generosity. And what Trosper, you know, one of the things that is suggested is that perhaps this is a very ingenious way of avoiding conflict, which is obvious. I mean, it's just so simple. War is a very costly endeavor. It's costly to society. Today, a few people profit immensely from war, but society bears the burden on both sides of the equation. Now, if you have a neighboring tribe that could potentially be your enemy, it's wiser to ceremony, and it's less costly, by the way. It's less costly just to give away surplus goods to your neighbors, and then they give you your surplus good, their surplus goods, and we connect interconnecting relationships.
And investment.
Yeah.
Investment in relationship, investment in your future.
Yeah, yeah. And this brings me back to the so-called historical peace and friendship treaties, as it described to me by some of the elders. And I met late William Commanda before he passed away. He was a wampum belt carrier, and I've listened to many of the elders, like Elder Larry McDermott. He's taught me a lot. He's an elder himself, but he always talks about the elders and all the people who've taught him. That the so-called historical peace and friendship treaties was built into it is this notion of peaceful commerce. Peaceful commerce, and what I call bioregional economics. And yes, there was collective security. Collective security was the part that the United States really hopped onto. By the way, the founding fathers of the United States of America were inspired by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Great Law of Peace, one spoon, one dish treaty, and all that, the peacemaker. This notion of collective security is similar to what Thomas Hobbes was writing about as well, is that if we create a treaty alliance and we have this notion of collective security, if one of our members is attacked by an outsider, it is considered that every member of that treaty alliance is attacked. And we all go to war on behalf of that one. And you know, that was the part that the United States really liked. But there's two other parts they were missing. They were missing this notion of peaceful commerce and bioregional economics. Bioregional economics is quite simple. Depending on where you are in relation to the equator, you have different seasons. And different seasons and different types of produce, things that live, populations of fish, vegetation, ungulates, so on and so forth, migratory birds. It's all seasonal. And so if you have a great river system that connects several bioregions that all experience the seasons differently, then you have to have peaceful commerce within that. Otherwise, it's going to lead to conflict, because in some parts of the system, there may be periods of you know, of a lack of resources. And so peaceful commerce allows for those surplus goods to travel peacefully through different tribal alliances. And that reaffirmation of relationship, and like you said, investing in relationships. So they had some things figured out, those folks, and that's what I want to see. I want to see a renaissance of peace and friendship, and the true economic principles that were built into those things, and respecting the land. And it needs to be said that a peace and friendship treaty isn't just done once and then it's forever. You have to continually renew that relationship, and usually it'd be done annually. You know, like our brothers and sisters in Thayendanegea, the namesake of Joseph Brant, who was one of the most influential characters in the history of North America, from Mohawk Nation, Haudenosaunee. They so eloquently spoke. Maybe you read their letter when they were blockading trains. Well, they didn't blockade; they were, you know, camped out around the rail tracks, shutting down train traffic. And they had wrote an eloquent letter, a beautiful letter to the Crown, and saying, "Look, we have a treaty relationship with you, and in that treaty relationship, we agreed to the Silver Chain Covenant, and we expect." Just like the Pledge of Allegiance wampum with the zaggy lines, we expect that from time to time, our relationship will become tarnished if we don't get together enough to shine and keep that bright and new. And they had an agreement with the Crown that when the relationship gets tarnished and our treaty becomes tarnished, we have to get together and we have to polish the Silver Covenant chain together and make it bright and new again. These are simple ideas, but they're so powerful. And that's how great societies collaborated. The peacemaker, and the two-row wampum belts and all of that stuff. It's powerful symbology in ingenious geopolitics and international relations. And so we talk about Indigenous protected and conserved areas, or tribal parks, and right across Canada, I see these as areas where we can experiment with on how to have better relationships, how to truly live in parallel sovereignty and peaceful coexistence, and not just with one another, but with the land. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, one of the quotes there that really, to me, sums it all up in a way, is they said that reconciliation between Crown and Indigenous peoples can never happen until there's reconciliation with the land. We need to reconcile our relationship with our Mother Earth as a people.
I have a question for you. It's a big one. You ready?
Yeah.
So Sid here, who's a regular on this show, thanks Sid, says, looking at potential ecological impacts, what percentage of environmental statements made any attempt to quantify them? Of these, which made reference to ecological effects, mega projects, environmental assessment process, a process in which values are elicited, a need to map values, social or cultural values, ecosystem components, a comment? Does any of that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Do you want to address it?
Sure. I mean, this question actually gets back to something that we were talking about earlier, and I was talking about how we need for the people who have to live with the consequences of their decisions, and you made the observation that we're all living collectively of the consequences, which is true, but out of sight, out of mind. And I'm reminded of a meeting that happened. It was a joint meeting between Tla'okwiyet, my chief in council, and the Tofino mayor and council on the West Coast. This was years and years ago. And my elders spoke about Nuu'chah'nulth Canadian. He shook Ish-Saawak as everything is one and everything is interconnected. He shook Nish-Saawak is we are all one. Saawak Nish, we are all one. And our elders spoke about how we're all here to stay. And it was a really beautiful meeting. But what was interesting to me is after the meeting, one of the elected members of the Tofino Council came up to me, and he kind of looked like he had seen a ghost. And this was a very bright young man, not super young. I mean, he's probably in his 30s or whatever. And he was saying, he said, "Oh my God!" And he had been a very outspoken council member up until that point. And he said, "You know what, Eli? I realized something of what your elders had said. My wife and I, we have young children, and we want them to go to a French immersion school, and we don't have one here in Tofino. So we've actually been planning to move to a place where our kids can go to school in French immersion." And he kind of realized that he wasn't going to be living with the consequences of his decisions. Like at that regional level, he wasn't going to be living with, he wasn't there to stay. And he was just cycling through, maybe a step in his adventure of life or whatever. And this transient nature of our society allows for people to make bad decisions. You don't have to live with the consequences. And this is even at the community level sometimes of stuff that happens. And then you just, well, move to the next town. And the decisions of policymakers, and this is one that just, it's so common, it's so commonsensical. It's like, how is this even a thing? But how somebody making a decision in a capital city, thousands of miles away, that's going to impact our lives, and they've never been here to our territory. They've never been on our lands, and they're never going to live here. Why? Who? It defies common sense, and that's why I say that we need to work together. So, so the question about impact, yeah, sure. I mean, we can have the Canadian environmental assessment. We can revitalize that, and we can have all that. It reminds me of a conference I attended in California. I was listening to lawyers and environmentalists lament at how that at the time, California, they're like, we have the best environmental laws in the world, but they're not worth anything if they're not followed. Because what corporations do, who have a responsibility to create wealth for their shareholders, they have to weigh the financial consequences of violating an environmental law. And if they can get away with dirty operations and dirty business practices and violate the law, and at the chance that they're caught and prosecuted, they might get a fine, but in the meantime, they've profited X numbers, and paying those fines is just seen as a part of doing business. So what really needs to change are the economic motivators. And what needs to change, really, we need a paradigm shift of what it means to be human and the nature of humanity and the interconnection of all things. I had the honor of speaking at a conference in India, in the province of Shillong, Meghalaya. There was the slow food Indigenous Terra Madre, which was the slow food movement. Terra Madre came out of Italy, apparently, and one of the big people behind that was Prince Charles from the royal family, and he provided a keynote presentation on the opening day. It was a crazy conference. It was like Bollywood in there. It was so beautiful. It was just like incredible, the colors but it was weird too, because we had military everywhere, bomb sniffing dogs, guys with machine guns walking around all the time. It was a bizarre conference, and Prince Charles, yeah, he had prepared a keynote presentation, and he went through fairly elaborate explanation. And the guy's a very compelling speaker. And he said, with much also humor, he explained that all of the things that we point to as being the problems in the world are actually only symptoms of an underlying root problem. And he described it how that underlying root problem from which all others wellspring from is a worldview of disconnectedness, seeing things in pieces, seeing human beings as separate from nature, Black people separate from white people, Muslims separate from Christians, like this cascading series of disconnection. And then he turned to the audience and said, but it's you Indigenous peoples. And there was like 600 delegates from all over the world. Winona LaDuke was the other rep from North America who was there. And he said, but it's you Indigenous people who know and who's always understood that everything is interconnected. And with kind of tongue in cheek, he said, so could you now solve all the problems that we've created? And
could you lend us some money there, Prince Charles?
They have to fix up the palace first, apparently. I don't know. And so I spoke after him, and the title of my talk was interesting. It's totally unplanned, but it was Hishik Ishtzawak. Everything is one and everything is interconnected. And it's that paradigm shift that needs to happen at that basic level. And the cool thing about paradigm shift is that it only takes a moment, it's like an epiphany. And then we need to have a whole bunch of other follow-up to that to say, okay, how do we live differently? With this, now that you've taken the blue pill or the pink pill, I forget which one, and the matrix.
You want to forget that,
Eli. What do we do with that knowledge now, and how do we live a better life?
Beautiful. Thank you. I think we've come to our full time, so I'd love to just give you any time if there's anything else you want to add. I mean, you kind of came full circle. I've linked the IISAAK OLAM website here, and I encourage everyone to check out IISAAK OLAM and the different projects, initiatives, podcasts, partnerships that you're involved in. So can you give us an update?
The IISAAK OLAM Foundation is a nonprofit society that focuses on knowledge mobilization and capacity development, primarily focused on building Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Canada has made commitments to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity to protect 17% of its inland territories and waters by this year to December 31st, 2020. And in the speech from the throne prior to the winter break, and in the mandate letters now today, the feds are looking at 25% by December 31st, 2025, and 30% by December 31st, 2030. And Indigenous protected and conserved areas are likely going to be one of the most readily available tool to be able to do that. Now, it's important to note that from an Indigenous worldview, 25% or 30% is it's part of that dysfunctionality, that seeing the world in pieces, which is goofy and self-destructive.
Right.
But what we said is we will help you to achieve your targets, but you have to help us to achieve our goals too. And so, and that's about regaining land and jurisdiction, good in allowing for better governance of watersheds and land base. Indigenous peoples, the difference with an IPCA from a national park or a provincial park is that we see community as an intimate, inextricably linked part of an ecosystem. And so we have to have better housing. We have to have green infrastructure. We have to have high energy performing houses, food systems, all of that stuff, true microeconomic development. And so We are pursuing that, and we've got a national research project called Conservation through Reconciliation Partnership. Before the word reconciliation was totally sullied, and I differentiate our use of the word reconciliation. We're really talking about true reconciliation, not conference or speech reconciliation. We're talking about it at a watershed, human to human level. Anyways, I've definitely made my word count for the morning, and
so reconciliation is not dead if it's at a watershed, regional, local level. Let's just cement that in. Is that okay? I'm hearing you right. Okay, good. You're getting a lot of thanks. People are very grateful for your time.
But I don't want that to be the last point, because what I will say is, last point is that we are looking at creating a more COVID resilient society, and we are looking at fostering essential economics. One of the gifts of the COVID pandemic is it has allowed us to talk about building in supply chain security at the domestic level, and not always having to be part in the global exchange system, because we recognize, well, and I loved every minute of it. I heard these people talking about establishing domestic supply chain. You would have been booed out of the room before COVID for being a protectionist. But now we have that liberty. You know, it's common sense, really. It always was common sense. But so essential economics and COVID resiliency through Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Cleco, thanks for all you do, Emily, and for all of the good questions and comments from your viewers.
Thanks so much, Eli, for your time. We're going to keep up to date with what you're doing and see how we can be involved and participate. And we'd love to have you back on here. I think we just have this open door, all the speakers who have spoken, taken their time, just some really good conversations, and all the solutions, all the solutions are there.
Yeah.
So let's just really listen and really implement them. Cleco, hi. And have a great day, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow. Candace Callison will join us. Looking forward to it. Take good care. And remember, disconnection is goofy and self-destructive.
Yeah. Okay, bye for now.
Eli. Take care.